Daniel Carter had seen fear in places most people would never survive, but he had never seen it look like this. A tiny 11-week-old German Shepherd puppy was wrapped around his retired canine's leg, refusing to let go. If Ranger moved, Milo panicked. If Ranger didn't eat, Milo wouldn't eat. If Ranger disappeared, Milo searched until he found him. Then the next morning, everything changed. Milo suddenly left Ranger behind and ran through the snow toward an abandoned house at the end of Cedar Road. Why would a puppy, terrified of being left, willingly run away from the only dog he trusted? Daniel followed him looking for an answer. He had no idea that soon, this frightened little puppy would be the one refusing to leave someone else behind. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Subscribe and join us. God bless you and your family. Early December settled heavily over Red Lodge, Montana. Fresh snow covered Cedar Road beneath the Beartooth Mountains, swallowing tire tracks, fence lines, and nearly every sound around the isolated. Daniel Carter stood at the kitchen window with a mug of black coffee cooling between. At 37, Daniel was an active-duty United States Navy SEAL, 6 feet tall, with a lean, muscular build, broad shoulders, a square, angular jaw, straight nose, defined cheekbones, blue-gray eyes, short, dark brown hair cut in a clean, high fade, and light stubble. His NWU Type 3 uniform remained neatly arranged from habit, even during leave, because years of discipline had made disorder uncomfortable. After months of training rotations and operational demands, Daniel had returned to his cabin wanting something simple. Several days when no one needed a decision from him. He had expected the silence to feel peaceful. Instead, after only 2 days, he noticed that he still woke before sunrise, checked doors twice, and listened automatically for anything unusual. Usually, the only sound worth noticing belonged to Ranger. The 9-year-old German Shepherd had once served as a military working canine before age and stiffness ended his operational years. Ranger was large and powerful, despite the silver beginning to show around his muzzle, with a deep matte black saddle, solid black facial mask, warm tan legs and chest, alert amber eyes, and a bare neck without collar or harness. He remained calm, intelligent, and disciplined, never wasting energy unless something deserved his attention. Every morning, Ranger walked the same slow loop around Daniel's property before returning to the porch. That morning, he was late. Daniel checked the clock. 10 minutes became 20. Irritation gave way to concern. He told himself Ranger knew the land better than he did, yet his body had already begun preparing for action before his mind admitted anything. Daniel pulled on his brown boots, stepped onto the porch, and reached for the keys to his dark pickup. Then movement appeared at the far end of Cedar Road. Ranger emerged through the falling snow, walking steadily toward. Daniel released a breath he had not realized he was holding. A second shape appeared behind him. At first, Daniel thought it was a dark clump of brush moving in the wind. Then it stumbled. It was a German Shepherd puppy, no more than 11 weeks old and dramatically smaller. The little male had a soft black and tan coat matted lightly with snow, a round puppy face, oversized paws, short, awkward legs, large brown eyes, and one ear beginning to stand, while the other still folded slightly. His narrow body looked a little too thin beneath the fluffy. Ranger took several more steps. The puppy hurried after him with short, clumsy movements, struggling through snow that reached nearly to his belly. Suddenly, he lunged forward and wrapped both tiny front legs around one of Ranger's forelegs. Ranger stopped. Daniel, the old canine, looked down, shifted his weight, and carefully pulled his leg free. He walked again. The puppy scrambled after him and grabbed the other leg. A low warning sound came from Ranger's chest. It was not aggression, only exhausted ear. The puppy released him immediately and crouched in the snow with both ears lowered. Daniel almost laughed. Then Ranger moved away. The puppy's expression changed so quickly that the humor vanished. Panic widened his eye. He launched after Ranger, slipped onto his chest, pushed himself upright, and clung to the older dog again, as though losing contact was more frightening than the warning. By the time Ranger reached the porch, Daniel no longer thought the behavior was funny. Ranger climbed the steps and walked inside, clearly expecting the matter to end there. The puppy remained below the porch, trembling from cold and uncertainty. Daniel crouched several feet away rather than reaching for him. Up close he could see dried dirt beneath the puppy's chest, small scratches on his legs, and snow caught between his toes. There was no collar and no identification. Daniel placed a bowl of water inside the doorway and backed away. The puppy stared at it but did not move. Instead, he looked toward Ranger. Daniel waited. Eventually, Ranger returned, took several drinks, then walked back toward the fireplace. Only then did the puppy climb the step, approach cautiously, and begin drinking. Every few seconds, his head lifted to make sure Ranger was still. Food produced the same reaction. Daniel placed a small portion in a shallow bowl, but the puppy only sniffed it. His eyes returned immediately to Ranger. Daniel took a piece of food and offered it to the older canine. Ranger swallowed without ceremony. The puppy watched carefully, then stepped forward and began eating as if permission had finally been granted. Daniel leaned against the counter, studying him. This was not ordinary hesitation. The puppy seemed to have created a simple rule for surviving the world. If Ranger drank, the water was safe. If Ranger ate, the food was safe. If Ranger stayed in the cabin, perhaps the cabin was safe too. Daniel felt something tighten behind his ribs. An 11-week-old puppy should have been curious about everything. This one appeared to need another animal to prove that ordinary things would not. Milo, Daniel said quietly when the puppy finished eating. The name arrived without much thought. Milo looked up immediately, brown eyes large beneath his uneven ears. Daniel almost smiled. Temporary, he added, more for himself than for. He found an old cushion, covered it with a clean blanket, and placed it near the fireplace. Milo sniffed the bed, circled once, then sat beside it. For half an hour he became more adventurous, investigating a boot, stealing one sock, and cautiously touching Ranger's tail with his nose. Ranger responded with a long, suffering stare. The cabin felt different. Daniel had come there specifically for silence, yet he caught himself listening from Milo's tiny footsteps whenever they stopped. The thought, attachment created responsibility, and responsibility was exactly what he had come to Red Lodge trying to escape for a few days. Late that night, Daniel walked back into the living room and found the new cushion empty. Milo had somehow climbed onto Ranger's bed and curled himself against the older dog's chest. Ranger was awake. He looked toward Daniel as if requesting assistance. Daniel raised. Ranger stood and moved to the other side of the fireplace. Milo woke instantly, stumbled off the bed, and followed. Ranger crossed the room again. Milo followed again. Finally, the old canine returned to his bed, lowered himself with a deep breath, and Milo pressed against him and fell asleep within minutes, one tiny paw resting across Ranger's leg. Daniel remained in the dark doorway, watching. Ranger could easily have moved again, but he did not. Daniel had spent years believing protection required action. Ranger was showing him something quieter. Sometimes protection meant simply staying. And Daniel could not stop wondering what had happened to make such a small puppy so terrified that someone. Morning arrived pale and windless over Red Lodge, Montana. Fresh snow brightened Cedar Road beneath a low gray sky, while the Beartooth Mountains disappeared behind clouds and frost feathered the cap. Milo had apparently decided overnight that Ranger knew everything worth knowing. When Ranger walked into the kitchen, the 11-week-old puppy hurried after him on short, awkward legs, his oversized paws clicking unevenly across the. When Ranger sat beside the back door, Milo stared at him, lowered his own rear end, leaned too far sideways, and slowly tipped onto his hip. Daniel laughed before he could stop himself. Milo scrambled upright and looked accusingly at Ranger, as though the older dog had demonstrated the movement incorrectly. Ranger stared straight ahead with the solemn patience of a canine who had already accepted that dignity would be difficult to maintain around. Daniel realized the cabin sounded different now. Tiny claws crossed the floor. A missing sock appeared beneath the table. Milo sneezed after burying his nose too deeply in Ranger. Daniel had come to Red Lodge, seeking silence. Yet he found himself listening for those small noises whenever. After breakfast, Daniel opened the back door. Ranger stepped onto the porch first, and Milo followed immediately, struggling down the shallow steps because snow reached nearly to his belly. Ranger moved toward the fence at his usual measured pace. Milo bounded behind him, sometimes disappearing chest-deep into softer drifts before climbing out again. Daniel stayed near the porch, amused by the obvious difference between the two shepherds. Ranger looked controlled, and Milo seemed constructed entirely from enthusiasm and badly coordinated feet. Then the puppy stopped. His body became so still that Daniel noticed at once. Milo's tail lowered, the ear that normally stood halfway upright, folded back with the other. His brown eyes fixed beyond the yard toward the far end of Cedar Road. Ranger took several more steps, realized the puppy was no longer following, and turned. Daniel followed Milo. Beyond a sagging fence stood an old timber house Daniel had barely noticed since returning to Montana. The place had been empty recently, its porch buried beneath snow and its windows dark behind weathered frames. No smoke rose from the chimney. No tracks crossed the yard. Milo stared at it as if everything else around him had vanished. A small whine slipped from his throat. "Milo," Daniel called quietly. The puppy did not look back. Then his tiny body pushed through the snow with desperate determination, each stride little more than a leap. Twice he stumbled forward onto his chest. Both times he scrambled up and kept going. Ranger reacted instantly, accelerating after him. Daniel was already moving when Ranger caught Milo several yards short of the abandoned property and stepped across his path. Milo tried to go around. Ranger blocked him again. The puppy stopped, trembling, his eyes still fixed. Daniel reached them and crouched without touching Milo immediately. The puppy's breathing came fast, though the short run alone could not explain the tension in his body. Ranger stood beside him, calm but watchful. Daniel finally placed one hand against Milo's narrow. The puppy allowed the contact, but did not stop staring toward the abandoned house. Daniel felt the question settle heavily in his mind. Yesterday, Milo had refused food until Ranger proved it safe. Today, he had willingly separated from Ranger for the first time, only because that house had pulled him toward it. Whatever connection existed, Daniel did not intend to guess. He carried Milo back through the deeper snow rather than forcing the puppy to struggle, while Ranger walked beside them. By the time they reached the cabin, Daniel had made it. Before learning anything about the house, he needed to know whether Milo was healthy enough to be outside. That afternoon, Daniel drove both dogs into Red Lodge to a small veterinary clinic near the edge of town. Dr. Emily Harris, 44, met them in the examination. Emily was a slender woman of medium height with fair skin, thoughtful hazel eyes, and dark brown hair tied into a practical low ponytail. Fine lines around her eyes softened an otherwise focused expression. Nearly 20 years of treating ranch dogs, search animals, and retired working canines had given her an unusual patience. She rarely reached toward a frightened dog before allowing it time to study her. Milo remained partly behind Ranger at first. Emily sat sideways on a low stool instead of approaching directly, and spoke quietly to Daniel while the puppy investigated the room. Within several minutes, Milo crept forward and sniffed the toe of her shoe. Only then did Emily begin examining. The results were reassuring. Milo was approximately 10 to 11 weeks old, slightly underweight, but not dangerously so. The small scratches on his legs were superficial. His lungs sounded clear, and his joints showed no obvious. His paws suggested he had spent time outdoors, but there was no sign of serious exposure injury. Emily scanned him twice for a microchip and found none. She contacted the local shelter and checked the current missing animal. No young German shepherd matching Milo's age, coloring, and description had been reported. Daniel agreed to keep him temporarily, while the shelter continued checking. Emily made no dramatic conclusions about how Milo had ended up on Cedar. What interested her more was his behavior. When Ranger moved toward the examination room door, Milo's head snapped around immediately. His body tightened before Ranger had gone even a few feet. Emily asked Daniel to notice the difference. Milo had allowed her to touch his paws and ears. He accepted Daniel handling him. He did not appear generally terrified of people. But when Ranger increased the distance between them, Milo's breathing changed, and he tried. Emily explained that a puppy exposed to sudden instability could attach intensely to something predictable. Ranger might have become an anchor simply because he had stayed long enough to be trusted. "I wouldn't decide what happened to him yet," Emily said. "You don't have enough information." Daniel appreciated that. He disliked easy answers built on weak evidence. Emily looked toward Milo, now sitting awkwardly beside Ranger's front leg. "But he does seem to believe Daniel thought again about the abandoned house and about Milo running toward it, despite his fear of leaving Ranger. Two impulses were fighting inside the puppy: the need to stay close to safety and the need to return to something he... That evening, the temperature dropped quickly. Milo fell asleep beside the fireplace after exhausting himself with a rope toy almost as large as his head. Daniel pulled on his boots to bring in more wood, and Ranger followed him outside. Neither man nor dog deliberately tested Milo. They were gone only a few minutes. When Daniel returned with an armful of split logs, he heard rapid claws across the floor before opening the door. Milo was awake. He ran from Ranger's empty bed toward the hallway, then back to the kitchen, whining softly. Daniel called his name, but the puppy's attention remained fixed on the missing dog. Then Ranger appeared behind Daniel in the doorway. Milo He hurried forward, pressed his tiny nose against Ranger's foreleg, and stood there. His breathing slowed almost immediately. Ranger lowered his head and sniffed the top of Milo's uneven ears. Later, with both shepherds settled beside the fire, Daniel sat alone in his chair and watched Milo sleep. The puppy no longer needed to wrap his legs around Ranger every minute, but even asleep he had positioned one small paw close enough to touch the old. Daniel finally understood that the behavior he had laughed at on the first morning carried more weight than he had imagined. Milo was not simply following the strongest dog he could find. Somewhere in his very short life, disappearance had become... Daniel looked toward the dark window, knowing the abandoned house waited somewhere beyond the snow. He still did not know what Milo remembered about that place, and he refused to invent an answer. But he knew what Milo... For a puppy barely old enough to understand the world, someone leaving the room did not yet mean they would return. Sometimes, in Milo's mind, leaving meant they might be gone. 2 days later, another winter system gathered above the Beartooth Mountains. Wind swept powder across Cedar Road. The temperature dropped steadily, and the afternoon sky over Red Lodge turned the dull gray that usually meant more snow before... Daniel was carrying split firewood toward the cabin when an aging, dark green Subaru turned into his driveway. Margaret, Maggie Lewis, 63, climbed out with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. Maggie stood about 5'6" with a sturdy frame, fair, weathered skin, sharp green eyes, and shoulder-length auburn hair threaded heavily with gray. She wore a dark brown insulated coat, charcoal pants, a gray knitted scarf, and brown winter boots. Her husband had died 6 years earlier, but grief had made Maggie more involved with people, rather. She now ran a small community pantry and warming station near Cedar Road, quietly keeping track of elderly residents, isolated workers, and anyone likely to run short of food or heat during... Daniel liked her, which was precisely why he knew she had probably come to ask him for... Milo watched from beneath Ranger's chest as Maggie approached the porch. The 11-week-old German Shepherd puppy was still dramatically smaller than the old canine, and he used Ranger like a movable wall whenever someone unfamiliar arrived. Maggie noticed, but wisely ignored him. Instead, she explained that the early cold snap had emptied pantry shelves faster than expected. A supply delivery had arrived with canned food, blankets, firewood bundles, and several compact... Another storm was forecast overnight, and Maggie needed help moving everything before the access road iced over. Daniel knew what answer she wanted. He also knew why he did not want to give it. He had spent months responding whenever somebody needed something. Leave was supposed to mean no mission, no schedule, no responsibility beyond himself and Ranger. "I can't," he said, although nothing physically prevented him. Maggie studied his face for a second and understood immediately. "You're on leave," she said. "I know," Daniel nodded. "Exactly." Maggie did not argue. She adjusted her scarf and looked toward the stacked wood beside the porch. "Resting is one thing, Daniel. Disappearing from everybody is another." The sentence irritated him more than an accusation would have. Maggie returned to her car before he could answer. Daniel watched the Subaru disappear behind falling snow, telling himself she was wrong. He had earned the right to shut the world out for a few. Yet while he carried the remaining logs inside, the words followed him. He had always been comfortable being useful because usefulness gave him control. What he hated was the invisible expectation attached to it, the sense that if he stopped carrying weight, something might fall. Ranger settled near the fireplace. Milo climbed beside him. Daniel wondered whether isolation sometimes looked peaceful only because nobody was close enough to ask anything. Shortly after 10 that night, Milo abruptly stopped chewing the corner of an old rope toy. His half-folded ear lifted. Ranger raised his head a second later. Milo hurried toward the front door, gave 2 sharp puppy barks, then looked back. When Daniel remained seated, Milo scratched once at the door. Daniel opened it, expecting a bathroom break. Instead, Milo bounded into the snow, made it perhaps 20 feet, then turned around and barked again. Ranger stepped. Milo immediately moved farther down Cedar Road, repeatedly checking that they followed. Daniel pulled on his boots and went after them. The puppy could not travel quickly through the deeper drifts, so Ranger deliberately shortened his stride, keeping himself within their direction surprised Daniel. Milo was not heading toward the abandoned house. He was moving toward the community pantry less than half a mile. One exterior lamp burned above the pantry door. A man stood beside the open shelving with a paper grocery bag in his hand. Frank Dawson, 71, was a retired diesel mechanic Daniel recognized from the local hardware store. Frank had a broad frame softened by age, slightly stooped shoulders, weathered tan skin, a square face, thick gray eyebrows, thinning silver hair beneath a faded wool cap, and a short white beard along his large hands were scarred and permanently rough from decades spent inside engines. Since losing his wife, Carol, after 46 years of marriage, Frank had become increasingly private and fiercely self. Tonight, he was taking cans from the bag and placing them back on the pantry shelf. Maggie emerged from the storage room behind him, saw what he was doing, and immediately folded her arms. "Frank, I'm returning them," Frank said without looking at her. Maggie reminded him that his truck was waiting on a replacement part and the weather was getting worse. Frank insisted someone else needed the food more. Daniel stayed near the doorway, listening. He recognized the argument before Maggie finished answering it. Frank was not refusing because he had enough. He was refusing because accepting help felt like surrendering a piece of himself. Daniel understood that instinct uncomfortably. For most of his adult life, people had depended on him to remain capable under pressure. He had learned to measure himself by how little assistance he required. Frank reached for another can. Maggie quietly pushed the bag closer to him. Milo, meanwhile, peeked around Ranger's front leg and noticed one of Frank's brown leather work gloves resting on the lower. Before Daniel could stop him, Milo darted forward, grabbed the glove, and ran. His escape lasted 4 spectacularly awkward steps. His oversized front paws crossed beneath him on the packed snow, and the tiny shepherd rolled gently onto his side, still holding the glove in his mouth. Everyone froze. Milo scrambled upright, shook the glove with enormous seriousness, then nearly lost his balance. A laugh escaped Frank before he could prevent it. It sounded rusty and surprised, as though he had forgotten his body could make that noise. Maggie smiled. Daniel did too. Milo approached Frank cautiously and dropped the glove near one boot before retreating to Ranger. Frank picked it up, looked at the puppy, then back at the groceries. This time, instead of returning another can, he placed it inside the bag. Maggie said nothing. She understood that allowing him to change his mind without announcing it was its own form of... They left Frank with the groceries and his dignity intact. On the walk back, the snow had begun falling harder, collecting along Ranger's black saddle and across Milo's fluffy puppy. Ranger moved noticeably slower than usual, not because of his age, but because Milo's little legs could not keep pace. Every few yards, Milo stumbled into a drift, climbed out, and hurried forward until he was beside Ranger again. Daniel followed them in silence. Maggie had needed help, and he had refused because he did not want to be needed. Frank had needed help and nearly refused because he did not want to need anyone. The two positions suddenly looked less different than Daniel had. Both were ways of protecting yourself from dependence. Both kept other people at a safe... At the cabin, Ranger paused at the porch until Milo climbed the first snowy step, then went inside beside him. Daniel remained outside for another moment, looking toward the pantry's faint light. He had thought Ranger bringing home a frightened puppy had created a temporary disruption in an otherwise quiet leave. Instead, Milo seemed to be pulling threads between people who had carefully learned how to stand alone. Frank had laughed. Maggie had accepted help without humiliating him. Ranger had slowed his own pace for something smaller. And Daniel, despite himself, had gone out into the cold when Milo asked him to follow. He closed the door behind them and looked at the puppy curling beside Ranger. Maybe Milo was not the only one learning that needing someone did not always make you. 3 mornings later, Red Lodge lay beneath a hard blue winter sky. Snow covered Cedar Road in an unbroken sheet, and the abandoned house at the far end seemed even more isolated than... Daniel noticed Milo staring at it before the puppy moved. The 11-week-old German Shepherd had been playing beside Ranger near the porch, clumsily attacking a pine cone almost as large as his muzzle, when his body suddenly went still. His partly folded ear, his brown eyes fixed beyond the fence. Daniel knew the expression now. Milo! The puppy hesitated just long enough to show that he heard him, then his short legs fought through the snow, oversized paws punching into the powder as he headed directly toward the empty property. Daniel dropped the piece of firewood in his hands and followed. Ranger was already at... Milo reached the sagging fence first and flattened himself beneath a narrow gap between the lowest board and the frozen ground. His small body disappeared through it easily. Ranger tried the same route, realized his shoulders would never fit, and immediately turned toward a broken section farther. By the time Daniel and Ranger entered the property, Milo had vanished behind the old house. The place felt colder than Daniel's cabin, despite being only a short distance away. No smoke rose from the chimney, and snow had collected untouched across. Daniel rounded the back corner just as a sharp metallic crash broke the silence. Ranger accelerated toward a weathered storage shed leaning slightly beneath the weight. Daniel followed and found Milo trapped in a narrow space between several fallen boards and a bent sheet of lightweight roofing metal. The puppy was standing, apparently uninjured, but panic had taken control. Every attempt to back out shifted the metal above. Daniel slowed immediately. Easy, Milo. He crouched and extended one hand, but the closer he came, the harder Milo struggled. Daniel stopped. Years of training had taught him that sometimes moving faster only made a problem. Ranger stepped past Daniel without making a sound. The old canine stopped several feet from the opening, where Milo could see him clearly. He did not bark, paw at the debris, or attempt to force his way closer. He simply stood there, amber eyes fixed on the pup. Milo looked at Ranger. His frantic movements weakened, then stopped completely. His breathing remained fast, but the panic was fading. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Ranger had done nothing dramatic. He had merely stayed where Milo could. Daniel carefully lifted the edge of the roofing sheet, tested its weight, then shifted one board away from Milo's shoulder. When the opening became wide enough, he reached inside and supported the puppy beneath the chest. Milo came free. Daniel checked his legs, paws, ribs, and belly. No bleeding, no limp, nothing worse than dust and a frightened heartbeat. The moment Daniel set him down, Milo pressed his tiny body against Ranger's. Daniel was ready to leave when he noticed something beneath the snow beside the shed. A small, stainless steel dog bowl protruded from beneath frozen leaves. It was scratched and dirty, but clearly sized for a puppy rather than a full-grown. Several feet away, a strip of faded blue material rested beneath a broken board. Daniel pulled it free and discovered a narrow puppy collar. The fabric was stained and weathered, though not old enough to have been outside for years. A small metal tag hung. Daniel wiped away dirt with his thumb. Most of the engraving was unreadable, but 2 letters and the beginning of another remained visible. M.I. He looked at Milo. The puppy was no longer watching Ranger. Instead, he stood beside the old canine, staring toward the back door of the abandoned house. Daniel felt the temptation to connect everything immediately, but training had also taught him the danger of treating a possibility. Later that afternoon, Maggie stopped at Daniel's cabin after checking the pantry. When he showed her the bowl and collar, her expression, she knew the house had been occupied until roughly 2 weeks earlier by a middle-aged couple who had come to Red Lodge hoping to keep a small home repair business alive. Work had become scarce, debts accumulated, and their departure had happened. Maggie remembered seeing a moving trailer outside one morning and an empty driveway less than 2 days later. She had never known. A local delivery driver had once mentioned seeing a tiny German Shepherd puppy in the backyard during the final weeks they lived there. But Maggie could not say whether that puppy was. No one knew whether the couple had arranged for someone to collect the dog, whether Milo had wandered away during the move, or whether another explanation existed. "That's all I know," Maggie said. Daniel appreciated that she left the uncertainty. The unanswered questions bothered him anyway. Daniel had spent too many years solving problems under pressure to feel comfortable leaving pieces disconnected. The collar seemed suggestive. The house obviously meant something to Milo. The timing, he could have started asking neighbors, tracing names, making calls, turning every fragment into another lead. For several minutes, that instinct felt almost automatic. Then Daniel looked across the room. Milo was asleep beside Ranger, his tiny paws twitching. He was not evidence. He was not an assignment. Daniel had no proof that anyone had intentionally abandoned him, and he refused to invent cruelty merely because cruelty would create a cleaner story. Perhaps somebody had made a mistake. Perhaps Milo had slipped away before someone could return. Daniel placed the collar and bowl inside a cabinet. Whatever had happened, the puppy did not need Daniel to prosecute the past. He needed the present to become predictable. That evening, Milo was unusually quiet. He followed Ranger around the cabin, but did not steal socks or attack the rope toy. When Ranger settled beside the fireplace, Milo climbed onto the edge of his bed and curled against the older dogs. Daniel sat across from them with a book he never actually opened. After several minutes, Milo stirred. His eyes opened halfway. One small paw reached forward until it touched Ranger's foreleg. Contact made, Milo relaxed and fell asleep. 10 minutes later, the same thing happened. Wake, search, touch, sleep. Ranger tolerated each check without moving. Daniel watched the pattern until its meaning became impossible to ignore. The puppy was not simply even while sleeping. Some part of him needed confirmation that Ranger had not. Daniel leaned back and listened to the fire settle. On the first morning, Milo wrapping both paws around Ranger's leg had seemed almost comical. Now Daniel understood that the gesture had probably never meant take me. It carried a more frightening question for a puppy barely old enough to understand permanence. "Will you still be here when I look again?" Daniel looked toward Ranger, whose head rested calmly beside Milo's small. He still did not know what had happened at the abandoned house, and perhaps he never would. But the exact details suddenly mattered less than the wound they had left behind. Milo had once associated a place with safety, and then that safety disappeared. Tonight, whenever he opened his eyes, Ranger was still there. Daniel remained there too. For now, that was enough. And perhaps enough repeated nights could someday teach Milo that waking up did not always mean discovering someone had. Winter sunlight returned to Red Lodge after 3 days of cloud, turning Cedar Road brilliant white and filling Daniel Carter's cabin with the kind of quiet brightness that made every small movement easy. Daniel had decided that Milo did not need to become a miniature working dog. At 11 weeks old, the German Shepherd puppy still sometimes tripped over his oversized paws and occasionally forgot what he was doing halfway across a room. What he needed was Daniel therefore allowed Ranger to teach without turning the process into formal training. Each morning, Ranger automatically sat before Daniel opened the back door. Milo watched closely. The first time he copied him, the puppy lowered his rear end, leaned too far to one side, and slowly collapsed against Ranger's leg. Daniel laughed. Ranger gave him a patient, amber-eyed stare. By the fourth morning, Milo remained up. When Ranger stopped at the edge of Cedar Road, Milo initially bounced ahead, noticed the older canine had not followed, then hurried back. A few days later, Milo stopped beside him without being asked. Daniel noticed that Ranger had begun adjusting as well. The old canine no longer treated Milo's constant presence like an inconvenience. When Daniel called Ranger from the far side of the yard, Milo would race behind him with short, enthusiastic strides. Sometimes the puppy arrived too quickly and bumped directly into Ranger's rear legs. Ranger would turn, stare at him for a moment, then continue walking. Daniel began recognizing the expression as patience stretched almost to. Yet Ranger also slowed when snow became too deep for Milo and waited at the porch steps when the puppy struggled to climb them. Daniel never praised Ranger for those choices. He suspected the dog would have considered praise unnecessary. The important change was quiet. Milo still followed Ranger, but he was beginning to observe instead of cling. The difference seemed small from the outside. To Daniel, it felt it. The clearest proof came one afternoon after Milo exhausted himself chasing a rope toy near the fireplace. The puppy fell asleep with his nose buried beneath one paw. Daniel stepped outside to check a loose gutter bracket, and Ranger followed him in. Several minutes later, Daniel glanced through the glass door. Milo was awake. For an instant, the puppy looked exactly as he had before, head turning quickly toward Ranger's empty bed, body tense, ears pulled back. Milo walked toward the hallway, stopped, then went to the glass door instead. Ranger was visible outside beside Daniel. Milo stared for nearly a minute. Then something unexpected happened. He turned away from. When Daniel came back inside a few moments later, Milo crossed the room and lowered himself directly over Daniel's brown military boots. His breathing slowed until he was almost asleep. Daniel remained perfectly still. He understood that moving his feet would not truly matter, but he did not want to disturb the moment. Ranger was still outside, and Milo knew it. Yet the puppy had chosen Daniel rather than demanding immediate contact with the older dog. When Ranger finally entered, Milo lifted his head and watched him cross the room. Daniel expected the familiar scramble to follow. Milo stayed where he was. Ranger paused beside the fireplace, looked first at Milo and then at Daniel, and settled onto his own. Daniel rested one hand lightly along Milo's back. For weeks, he had watched the puppy learn that food could be safe, rooms could be safe, and people could remain predictable. This was something. Milo was beginning to understand that safety did not disappear simply because someone stepped beyond reach. Daniel wondered how many times a lesson had to repeat before fear finally surrendered. The following morning, Daniel drove to the community pantry without waiting for Maggie to. She was standing near the rear entrance in her familiar dark brown winter coat, her gray-streaked auburn hair escaping from beneath her scarf as she inspected several boxes left from. When Daniel stepped from his pickup, she looked at him, then at the cargo straps in the truck bed. "Not a word," Daniel said. Maggie smiled. "Wasn't planning one." Together they carried canned food, blankets, and compact heaters. Daniel noticed that one section of the pantry roof had bowed slightly beneath accumulated snow. He climbed a ladder, cleared the load, and replaced 2 loose fasteners before more weather could damage it. Maggie did not thank him repeatedly. She simply handed him another box when he finished. Daniel discovered that he preferred that. Helping felt different when nobody expected him to carry everything. Near noon, Frank Dawson arrived carrying his battered red toolbox. His bruised pride appeared healthier than ever, although he still complained when Maggie asked whether he had eaten. The 71-year-old retired mechanic knelt beside the pantry's aging backup generator and listened to its uneven idle. Within minutes, he found corrosion around one electrical connection and a loose terminal. Daniel held a flashlight while Maggie brought coffee and stood nearby offering unwanted commentary. Frank told her the generator would run better if she stopped criticizing it. Maggie replied that the machine had more sense than he did. Daniel laughed before realizing how natural the sound had become. 3 people who had once been determined to handle their problems alone were now spending a morning solving one together. No agreement had created the group. It had simply happened. One small decision at a time. Daniel returned to the cabin that afternoon and found Milo asleep partly across Ranger's front paws. His phone rang while he was preparing dinner. The county shelter representative explained that Milo's owner's search period was nearing its end. No matching missing dog report had appeared, no microchip existed, and nobody had contacted them after Milo's description was circulated. Daniel had expected that news. What he had not expected was an adoption app. Michael Bennett, 54, a tall, broad-shouldered electrical contractor from Bozeman with close-cropped salt and pepper hair, calm brown eyes, a rectangular face, and a neatly trimmed gray beard, had applied with his wife. Laura Bennett, 52, was slim, medium height, fair-skinned, with warm hazel eyes and shoulder-length light brown hair beginning to silver at the temples. She worked from home as an insurance analyst. Their previous German Shepherd had lived nearly 13. Daniel opened the application after the call. Michael and Laura had a securely fenced property, strong veterinary references, flexible schedules, and years of experience with German Shepherds. Nothing in the file gave him a reason to distrust. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Across the room, Milo woke, stretched, and checked Ranger's position with a brief glance instead of touching him. Then the puppy crossed to Daniel and sat beside his chair. Daniel looked from Milo to the application. He had called the dog temporary from the first afternoon because the word protected him from imagining what came next. Now, next had arrived. A suitable home was waiting in Bozeman. Daniel should have felt relief. Instead, the thought of the cabin without Milo's crooked ears, clumsy paws, and unnecessary collection of stolen socks left an emptiness he could already feel. Milo was learning that leaving did not mean Daniel suspected he was about to learn what it meant to let someone. The next morning brought a hard gray sky over Red Lodge. Wind swept loose snow across Cedar Road, and the forecast warned that temperatures would fall sharply after sunset as another winter front moved toward the Beartooth. Daniel stood at the kitchen table with a small canvas travel bag open and he folded Milo's blanket first, then added the rope toy marked by tiny puppy teeth, the shallow stainless steel food bowl, and the old brown leather glove Frank had finally surrendered after Milo carried it around the pantry for several days. Milo slept near the fireplace, his 11-week-old body curled into a compact ball against Ranger's side. Ranger was eating breakfast when Daniel placed Milo's bowl inside the bag. The old canine stopped chewing. His amber eyes moved from the bag to the puppy, then back to Dan. Without finishing his meal, Ranger crossed the room and lowered himself beside Milo. The puppy stirred, pressed his round muzzle against Ranger's chest, and went back to sleep. Daniel kept one hand on the zipper longer than necessary. He had packed equipment for dangerous assignments without hesitation. Packing a puppy's blanket should have been easier. Somehow Daniel told himself he was only preparing for what might happen. Michael and Laura Bennett had not met Milo yet, and nothing had been finalized, but their application was strong. If the puppy eventually went to Bozeman, sending familiar objects with him could make the transition easier. Every part of that explanation made sense. None of it made the cabin feel less empty when Daniel imagined Milo. He had called the puppy Temporary from the beginning because temporary sounded controlled. Temporary meant Daniel could care without promising too much. But Ranger no longer behaved as though Milo were temporary. He waited when the puppy struggled through deep snow, shifted over when Milo crowded his bed, and now abandoned breakfast simply because a bag had appeared on. Daniel looked at the two dogs and realized all three of them understood change was approaching, although only one of them had words. The following afternoon, Daniel drove to the community pantry to help Maggie prepare for the incoming cold. She had emergency blankets stacked near the warming room and portable heaters lined against. Daniel moved boxes of canned food, while Maggie checked a list of residents who might need supplies if the secondary roads iced over. Frank arrived shortly before 4, wearing his faded dark green work jacket, gray wool cap, and brown leather boots. His broad frame was still sturdy despite his 71 years, and the short white beard along his square jaw had collected flecks. He inspected the generator he had repaired earlier, then announced that he was heading home to check the propane heater in his workshop before nightfall. Maggie immediately told him not to climb on anything. Frank gave her a flat look. "I've been fixing equipment longer than you've been giving orders." Daniel almost smiled. Frank pointed at him. "You stay out of that." Daniel remained at the pantry until the light began fading, then drove home with Ranger and Milo. The puppy had spent the afternoon investigating boxes, following Ranger, and falling asleep beneath Maggie's desk, so Daniel expected him to be back at the cabin. He let both dogs into the fenced yard while he carried supplies into the storage room. Ice had been collecting along the lower fence rails for days, and one old board near the side yard had loosened where frozen wood had pulled away from its. Daniel did not notice the opening. Milo did. By the time Daniel returned outside, Ranger was standing alone near the porch. Daniel waited for the familiar blur of black and tan fur to appear behind him. Nothing came. "Milo." Silence. Ranger turned toward. Daniel followed his gaze and saw the loose board hanging outward, leaving a narrow opening exactly the size an 11-week-old puppy could. Concern hit Daniel instantly, but Ranger was already working. The relaxed posture of retirement disappeared as the 9-year-old canine lowered his nose beside the opening. He moved several feet along the snow, circled back, inhaled again, then started towards Cedar. Daniel followed without interfering. Ranger's pace was faster than usual, controlled and purposeful, his old training returning beneath the stiffness of age. Daniel's first fear was the abandoned. Milo had already run toward it twice, and the thought of the puppy alone among broken boards and frozen debris tightened his chest. Yet Ranger passed the property without slowing. He crossed farther down Cedar Road and turned toward the cluster of homes near Frank Dawson's place. Fresh snow had already begun covering Milo's tiny tracks, but Ranger did not need them. He kept moving, pausing only once at an intersection before choosing the road toward Frank's work. They were still approaching the property when Daniel heard it. A high, urgent bark cut through the evening air. Another followed, then another. Ranger quickened his pace. Daniel broke into. Frank's workshop sat behind his house, a weathered wooden structure with a narrow side door that never closed completely because the bottom had warped over years of Montana winters. Milo appeared in the gap, his small face visible for half a second. He barked at Ranger, spun around, and disappeared inside. Daniel reached the doorway and immediately saw Frank lying on the wooden floor beside a low stool. One hand rested near his hip. His face was pale with discomfort, but his eyes. Milo moved in frantic little circles between Frank and the door. "I'm fine," Frank said. Daniel crouched beside him. "You're lying on the floor." Frank grimaced. "That observation training really paid off." Frank explained that he had climbed onto the low stool to inspect a heater vent connection. His boot slipped, and he landed awkwardly on his hip. He had tried to stand, but the pain stopped him. His phone was inside the house because he had expected the job to take 5. Daniel checked that Frank was alert and breathing normally, then asked him to remain still. He did not attempt to lift him. The workshop was cooling quickly, and outside temperatures were falling. Daniel took out his phone and called emergency services, giving the location and explaining that Frank had fallen, remained conscious, but could not safely stand. Milo ran to the doorway again, barked toward the yard, then hurried back to The puppy had no training and no understanding of emergency response. He simply knew something was wrong and refused to. While they waited, Milo's excitement finally overwhelmed him. He ran toward Ranger, pressed briefly beneath the older canine's chest, then turned back to Frank. Ranger lowered his head and touched Milo's crown with the puppy's breathing slowed, but he stayed near the fallen man. Frank looked at him and gave a tired smile. He said Milo had crawled through the gap beneath the workshop door perhaps half an hour after the fall. Frank had called out several times, unsure whether anyone could hear him. Milo had appeared, stared at him, then started barking. After that, the puppy repeatedly moved between Frank and the outside, as if searching for someone who might Daniel looked at Milo in silence. Only days earlier, the puppy had panicked when Ranger crossed a room without him. Tonight he had crossed Cedar Road without Ranger at all. Emergency responders arrived soon afterward and carefully moved Frank for medical evaluation. Once the vehicle left, the workshop yard became quiet again. Milo immediately returned to Ranger and leaned his entire tiny body against one large foreleg. Daniel crouched beside them and placed a hand along the puppy's back. Milo was still frightened. He had not suddenly become fearless, independent, or heroic in some impossible way. He had simply heard something, found someone who could not get up, and stayed long enough to make noise until help reached him. That was what moved Daniel most. Milo had once believed safety existed only wherever Ranger. Tonight, for the first time, he had willingly stepped away from that safety because someone else needed him. Daniel watched Ranger lower his head toward the puppy, and understood that Milo was learning more than how to trust those who stay. He was learning that sometimes he could be the one who stayed for. Morning settled quietly over Red Lodge after the storm, leaving Cedar Road covered in fresh snow and the Beartooth foothills hidden behind pale clouds. Daniel had barely finished his first coffee when the hospital confirmed that Frank had suffered a badly bruised hip and a mild muscle strain, but no fracture or serious internal injury. He would need several days of rest and strict instructions to stay off ladders and stools. Daniel thanked the nurse, ended the call, and looked toward the fireplace. Milo was awake beside Ranger, his tiny black and tan body curled against the older canine's foreleg. "Frank's going to be fine," Daniel said. Milo lifted his uneven ears at the familiar. Then, as if some tension inside him finally released, the 11-week-old puppy stood, walked directly to Ranger, and wrapped both little front paws around one of Ranger's legs. Daniel froze because the gesture was identical to the morning Ranger had brought Milo home. Back then, Ranger had responded with an irritated growl and carefully stepped away. This time, he did. The 9-year-old German shepherd looked down at the puppy clinging to him, his amber eyes calm beneath the black mask and silver beginning around his muzzle. Then Ranger lowered his head and gave one slow lick across the top of Milo's round puppy. Milo tightened his paws for a moment. Ranger stayed exactly where he was. Daniel felt something shift inside him. The relationship between the two dogs had changed without any single moment announcing it. Tolerance had become patience. Patience had become. Now, protection had become attachment. Ranger was no longer waiting for Milo to become someone else's responsibility. Whether Daniel was ready to admit it or not, the old canine had already decided Milo belonged beside him. Shortly after 10, tires crunched slowly through the snow outside. Daniel looked through the window and saw a dark SUV pull beside his pickup. Michael Bennett stepped out. At 54, Michael was tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cropped salt and pepper hair, a rectangular masculine face, calm brown eyes, and a neatly trimmed gray beard. His dark navy winter jacket and brown boots were practical rather than. His wife, Laura Bennett, 52, came around the passenger side. She was slim and medium height, with fair skin, warm hazel eyes, and shoulder-length light brown hair beginning to silver at the temples. Her cream-insulated coat stood out against the... Daniel already knew from their application that Michael worked as an electrical contractor and Laura worked from home as an insurance analyst. They had owned German Shepherds before. Daniel also knew he had spent the morning hoping, against reason, that something about them would feel wrong. Nothing did. Michael entered the cabin slowly and stopped several feet from Milo. Instead of reaching down, he crouched sideways and rested his hands loosely on his knees. Milo immediately moved closer to Ranger, peeking from behind the larger dog's chest. Michael simply... After nearly a minute, curiosity defeated caution. Milo stepped forward on his oversized puppy paws, sniffed Michael's boot, then his sleeve. Michael did not touch him until Milo leaned closer on his own. Laura sat near the edge of the sofa and asked Daniel about feeding times, house training, sleep patterns, vaccination plans, and how Milo reacted when Ranger disappeared from view. Her questions were careful and specific. When Daniel described Milo's earlier panic and the gradual improvement, she did not promise that affection would solve everything. "He'll need routine," she said, "and time." Daniel hated how much he agreed with. The meeting became easier for Milo and harder for Daniel. Milo discovered the lace on Michael's boot and attacked it with complete seriousness. Later, he carried his rope toy halfway across the room and dropped it near Michael before becoming distracted by Ranger's. Laura laughed when Milo attempted to sit beside Ranger and slowly tipped against the old canine's shoulder. Ranger looked toward Daniel with the same long-suffering expression he had worn. Daniel found himself smiling, then immediately remembered why Michael and Laura were there. He watched them for nearly an hour, searching for anything that might justify saying no. Michael never handled Milo roughly. Laura never crowded. They had a secure fenced yard, previous shepherd experience, flexible schedules, good veterinary references, and enough patience to allow a frightened puppy to develop at his own pace. Daniel realized with uncomfortable clarity that they could provide Milo a very good life. Eventually, Michael glanced at Laura, and Daniel understood the meeting had reached the point everyone had been avoiding. He walked to the kitchen and picked up the small canvas travel bag. Inside were Milo's blanket, shallow food bowl, rope toy, and Frank's old leather. The bag felt absurdly heavy in his hand. Milo noticed Daniel moving toward the front door and followed him automatically. Ranger remained several feet inside the living room. Laura opened the door and stepped onto the snowy porch. Milo hesitated at the threshold, then carefully descended the first step on his short legs. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He had spent days telling himself this was what responsible care. Milo needed stability, and Daniel was still an active-duty Navy SEAL whose work could take him away. Michael and Laura were not taking Milo from him. They were offering the puppy another. Milo stepped into the snow and moved several feet toward Michael. Then he stopped. His little tail lowered, one ear folded farther back. Michael crouched and called him softly, but Milo did not continue. He looked first at... Then he turned his head toward the open cabin door. Ranger stood inside, watching. For several seconds, the entire yard seemed silent. Milo took one uncertain step toward Michael, stopped again, then suddenly spun around. His short legs carried him back across the porch as quickly as they could. He rushed past Daniel, crossed the living room, and climbed awkwardly onto Ranger's bed. Once there, he circled once and curled himself into the exact place he had chosen on his first night. Daniel followed and stopped just inside the room. Michael and Laura remained quietly. Ranger approached the bed. Daniel remembered the first night perfectly. Milo had climbed onto the same bed, Ranger had stood up and moved away, and the puppy had followed him again and again until the older dog finally surrendered. This time Ranger did not. He stepped onto the bed, lowered himself beside Milo, then placed one large foreleg gently across the puppy's small back. Milo relaxed instantly beneath it. His eyes closed. Daniel stood with the travel bag still hanging. The image made every practical argument inside him suddenly feel incomplete. Milo had liked Michael and Laura. He had trusted them enough to walk outside, but when the choice became real, he had returned to Ranger, to the fireplace, to Daniel's cabin, to the place where he had slowly learned that food was safe and someone leaving a room could still come back. Daniel set the travel bag on the floor. He looked toward Michael and Laura, expecting disappointment. But Michael only studied the two dogs and gave a small, understanding nod. Laura's expression softened. Daniel took out his phone, but did not. "I think I need to call the shelter," he said. The sentence felt strangely frightening and strangely easy at the same time. Laura looked at Milo sleeping beneath Ranger's foreleg and smiled. There was no resentment in her face, only I think he just made the decision himself. Daniel looked at Milo again. For weeks he had assumed the hardest thing would be teaching the puppy that people could leave and still return. Standing there now, he realized Milo had learned something else first. He had learned how to recognize the place he wanted them to return to. Snow fell gently over Red Lodge the following morning, covering Cedar Road with a fresh white layer. Inside Daniel's cabin, Ranger and Milo slept together beside the fireplace, while the small travel bag remained untouched near the door. Daniel called the county shelter after breakfast. Milo's required owner search period had officially ended, no matching report had appeared, and nobody had come forward with proof of ownership. The remaining adoption process was straightforward. Michael and Laura Bennett withdrew their application without resentment after Daniel explained what had happened. Michael told him they had already asked the shelter about another German Shepherd needing a home, while Laura simply said Milo had made his preference. When the final confirmation arrived later that day, Daniel stared at his name beside Milo's longer than necessary. He had signed documents carrying far greater consequences without hesitation. Yet this one affected him differently. Milo was asleep across Ranger's paws, completely unaware that anything had changed legally. Daniel almost smiled. A piece of paper had made the arrangement official, but the truth was obvious. Ranger had brought Milo into the cabin weeks earlier. Somewhere between then and now, Milo had brought himself into Daniel. The relief lasted until Daniel looked at the calendar. His leave was almost over. He was still an active-duty Navy SEAL, and nothing about adopting Milo changed the responsibilities waiting for him. Training cycles, readiness requirements, and operational commitments could take him away from Montana for days or Ranger understood Daniel's absences after years together, but Milo had only recently learned that someone stepping outside the cabin did not mean permanent abandonment. Daniel could not build a happy ending around a promise his profession might prevent him. That evening, he sat near the fire while Milo slept against Ranger's chest and confronted a problem he normally would have solved alone. Part of him immediately began calculating boarding arrangements, schedules, transportation, contingency. Another part remembered Frank returning pantry food because accepting help felt unbearable. Daniel realized he was about to repeat the same mistake in a different. Maggie arrived the next afternoon carrying groceries and found Daniel studying his duty calendar at the kitchen table. He explained the problem reluctantly. Maggie listened, then gave him the kind of look suggesting he had complicated something. Her fenced property was less than half a mile away. Ranger already knew her house and yard, and Milo had become comfortable around her at the pantry. When Daniel had to leave, both dogs could stay with her. Daniel immediately began listing objections. Maggie allowed him to reach the third one before interrupting. "You've spent weeks teaching that puppy people can leave and come back. Maybe you should learn the same thing about help." Daniel looked at her. The sentence landed harder because there was no judgment. Maggie was not asking him to surrender responsibility. She was offering to share it. For Daniel, accepting that distinction was more difficult than he wanted to. Frank appeared the next morning, walking carefully but without the cane Maggie had tried to force on him after the workshop fall. His bruised hip was improving, though a slight stiffness remained in his. He carried a paper bag filled with containers of homemade stew and announced that he intended to help with Ranger and Milo whenever Daniel was away. Daniel started to object. Frank raised one thick gray eye. "The little one found me on a floor when nobody else knew I was there. "I think I can refill his water bowl." Then he added a condition. If Frank brought meals, coffee, or supplies to the cabin, Daniel was no longer allowed to pretend he did not. Daniel stared at the retired mechanic, remembering the man who had once tried to return a bag of groceries rather than accept assistance. Now Frank was insisting on being useful to someone else. The irony was impossible to miss. Daniel held out his hand. No speech was necessary. Before Daniel's leave ended, they turned the arrangement into something Milo could understand gradually. Daniel first left Ranger and Milo at Maggie's house for 20 minutes. Ranger remained completely relaxed, and Milo spent most of the visit inspecting the unfamiliar furniture before settling near the older canine. Daniel returned. The following day he stayed away for an hour. He returned again. Then Frank began stopping by while the dogs were there, usually with the excuse that Maggie's generator needed checking, even when it clearly did not. Milo learned the sound of his truck and eventually greeted him without hiding behind Ranger. Once Milo cried at the door for several minutes after Daniel drove away. Another time he refused to nap until Ranger lay beside him. But Daniel resisted the urge to treat every setback like failure. The lesson depended on repetition. Daniel left. Daniel came. Again and again, absence became predictable instead of. Several months later, deep winter had covered Red Lodge in white. Milo was older and stronger now, though still clearly younger and smaller than Ranger, with puppy softness remaining around his face and more confidence in the way he carried himself. Daniel returned from a short duty assignment on a Saturday afternoon, his dark pickup crunching into the driveway. Maggie and Frank had already brought the dogs home. Ranger met Daniel near the door with the controlled excitement of an old working canine, tail moving. Milo arrived a second later at full speed, stopped himself just before crashing into Daniel's knees, and pressed his face against Daniel's leg. Daniel crouched and held him briefly. What happened next mattered. Milo released him, carried a rope toy toward the fireplace, and settled as though Daniel's return had been expected all along. Months earlier, reunion had meant relief from terror. Now it simply meant someone had. The rest of their small world had changed too. Frank had rebuilt the pantry's unreliable generator using donated parts, and Maggie no longer moved every heavy delivery herself because several neighbors had quietly begun rotating. Frank had also developed a habit of appearing at Daniel's cabin on Saturday mornings with coffee and enough food for 2 men, while insisting he was only there to inspect something. One such morning, Ranger rose from beside the fireplace and wandered down the hall. Milo lifted his head. Daniel stopped mid-sip and watched. Once, Milo would have been moving before Ranger had taken 3 steps. This time, the young shepherd stared toward the empty doorway for several seconds. Then he lowered his chin onto Daniel's boot. Ranger had disappeared from sight, but Milo remained completely still. A few minutes later, Ranger returned. Milo jumped up happily, greeted him, then followed the older dog toward the fireplace. Daniel had recently bought Milo a thick new bed of his own, softer and larger than Ranger's worn one. It remained almost. Milo climbed directly onto Ranger's bed, turned twice, then pushed himself against the older canine until Ranger had barely half the space left. Ranger shifted, opened his amber eyes, and looked toward Daniel with weary resignation. Frank laughed from the opposite. Daniel took another sip of coffee. "Don't look at me, Ranger. You brought him home." Milo licked Ranger across the muzzle and settled beneath his foreleg. Daniel looked around the cabin he had once chosen because nobody would bother him. Now Maggie arrived without invitation. Frank occupied the second chair, Ranger shared his bed, and Milo no longer feared every closed door. Daniel finally understood that home was not the place where nobody left. Home was the place where people could leave and still have somewhere beside you waiting when they.
Sometimes God's miracles arrive quietly, not with thunder, but through a loyal dog, an open door, or someone who chooses to stay. Milo learned that leaving does not always mean abandonment, and Daniel learned that strength also means accepting help. In daily life, we may never know which small act of kindness becomes someone else's answer to prayer. So keep your heart open, make room beside you, and trust that God can use ordinary moments for extraordinary healing. If this story touched you, please share it, comment below, and subscribe. May God bless you, your family, and everyone watching today.